discussing Star Wars 1977 is one thing, but to me, the discussion of The Empire Strikes Back is an even more prominent one, because there was a long time when I considered Empire Strikes Back my absolute favourite film of all time. And Empire Strikes Back is very common, relatively, quite commonly cited. You'll see it in polls, typically reader polls, in Empire Magazine or whatever. Greatest film of all time, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back from 1980.
Well, if I might interject quickly, always greatest sequel. Or it's always in the list of greatest sequels.
Very true.
Empire and Godfather 2 and Jaws 2.
Good and the Bad and the Ugly sometimes is considered the third of a trilogy as well, so that will get up there as well.
But yeah, sorry to interject.
Please. Oh yeah, and Dark Knight these days too. Anyway, and Empire was just kind of, it was like a religion, as much as Star Wars was a religion to me. The more I got into film in general, via Star Wars obviously, the more I began to appreciate like Empire specifically as like the real bastion of the Star Wars saga. And it's easy to see why. And even now I look at Empire and I think every scene is magnificent. The cinematography, Peter Sujitsky's, I'm not pronouncing your surname correctly, I apologize sir, cinematography, outstanding. We had Irvin Kershner filling in for George Lucas to direct the actors. George Lucas, I believe, is still ghost directing everything, whereas, he knows he's not the greatest actor director in the world, so Irvin Kershner comes in to weave the finer acting than we ever expected in a Star Wars film, mainly between Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher, one of the great romances in cinema history, and a lot of people's opinions nowadays.
I'm even surprised Mark Hamill, that's probably his best acting.
I agree. Until, dare I say, Last Jedi, but that's controversial.
Sure. He's good in that. But he's not always the best actor.
He's just Mark Hamill,
He's leaps and bounds ahead of the first one, though. He's pretty good in that. He's believable.
He's fine in the first one, yeah.
Yeah, in Empire, he's acting against a puppet, and he does a pretty good job of it.
I agree. I take that.
Yoda just steals the scene. That's why you forget about it, I reckon.
Totally.
But yeah, Mark Hamill, even, obviously, Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford, better actors, and they have the great chemistry and all that. But I'm even surprised that Chewbacca and the droids are great in this movie too.
Yeah.
They even C-3PO. It's kind of that's his movie. This one is it's his time to shine.
Because R2's not with him to bounce across. That, so it is 3PO's. The
way he interjects into everyone else's sort of relationships, like between Han and Chewie and Han and Leia, and they just no one has the time for him.
That is part of the darkness of Empire, I think, intrinsically, especially when you watch it as a kid. There's no comfort of 3PO and R2 bickering, they're separate.
Yeah.
So you have Han, Leia, Chewie, and 3PO alone on the Falcon against this force of Star Destroyers in an asteroid belt, and Luke learning about the Force from Yoda, it becoming kind of scarier by the day, and kind of R2 there to accompany him. It's such an extraordinary, there's an extraordinary atmosphere in the film, really brought home by what a phenomenal utilization of the prophets of Star Wars to create the most seamless space opera fantasy vision of all time. The most perfectly aged of the Star Wars films. It doesn't have the 70s haircuts of the first film or the overabundance of Muppets and Ewoks in Return of the Jedi, which makes you think of the 1980s and Jim Henson, Dark Crystal Labyrinth and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Empire is perfectly. It almost is why Star Wars in the original trilogy has continued to have such a affect in people's minds, because you can watch something like Empire again, scenes from Empire again, and they look phenomenal. They look like timeless. They don't look like a film. It doesn't look like a film from the 70s or from the 80s. The production aesthetic on that film, they just nailed it.
Yeah.
And I'm still in awe of Empire. Still one of my absolute favorite films. This is the one Star Wars film where I know it can be balked at, the idea that these films are these great blockbuster fantasy flashforward and homages with a bit of Akira Kurosawa thrown in to make them really kind of satiating, ultimately Homeric. But Empire is the one where I feel as though these characters made iconic more or less overnight in 1977, they go through the more kind of dark, trying moments of a conflict, and we feel with them. We feel pain as Luke suffers, and that revelation. And here's what I want to mention: this is the Darth Vader film. This is the ultimate villain film until maybe we get to Wrath of Khan a couple of years later. This is I love what we do with Darth Vader here. I love how This is almost my favourite thing about the revelation at the end of the film, "No, Luke, I am your father." Well, "No, I am your father," I think is the exact line. Suddenly, all of Darth Vader's actions prior in the film they're given a new light, and all of a sudden we're like, oh my god, like this was like, this Darth Vader was trying to track down his son so he could he wants to overthrow the Emperor.
Yeah, he has ambitions for his own power, which
depth added to this character that we totally didn't expect, despite being with him for the entire film.
You think of him as just a henchman and a tough. He does the Bane thing from The Dark Knight Rises, where he's killing his own henchmen, but it's done in such a way that it's setting him up as that sort of character, and you're like, oh wow, he's needlessly brutal, and then you realise why. And then in Return of the Jedi, I actually find it fascinating where he mentions to one of the officers who's responsible for the construction of the second Death Star that if he doesn't get ahead on the schedule, he's going to be in real trouble because the Emperor is coming and he's not as forgiving as Vader is. Mm. And so that also paints it in a new light as well, where it's just like you see Vader as he's obviously not a good character, but he's just, in a Machiavellian sense, I guess, he wants to plot and take over the Emperor. Mm. So he's not really that submissive to... I guess that's the nature of the dark side, as they probably established later in various needless expanded universe things.
Of course they do.
Unnecessary mythology and whatnot, which is almost like half the reason why the original trilogy works is viewed in a vacuum. I don't know, it's just... It makes the universe bigger rather than smaller.
I've always adored how the original trilogy is an aesthetic. It's a kind of a futuristic war aesthetic, ultimately. Empires versus Rebels. And it's like a world where magic disappeared and there's only a few sides of it left.
Yeah.
And that's what I always loved about it.
Which is normally the setting for fantasy stories. It's like normally set in a more material time where
it's closer to Lord of the Rings anyway. There's only a few people who can use magic in the Lord of the Rings.
Exactly. Lord of the Rings is set in that time. It's not set in the Silmarillion era.
Yes, exactly. Which is the more the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah. It's set in a more... Even though there are outlandish, sort of mythological creatures and different races of beings, and men are only one minor portion of Middle Earth's population. It's sort of still a more grounded and more similar to our reality than the other ages of Middle Earth and all that stuff, where trees and the moon and the sun and things like that.
Yes.
That's the real mystical land. Whereas Lord of the Rings is set in the magic is disappearing.
Yeah.
Which is very similar to Star Wars, where that's set. This materialist empire is taking over.
Yeah.
And I guess it's being led by these evil, the people who are using the mystical forces of the universe for evil, and all the people using it for good have died.
Yeah.
And then I guess that's a problem with, say, the prequels, if we'll go into that briefly, but probably more later, where the structure of these Jedi, these good monks or whatever, are just sort of corrupting the power of the unit. It's not clear, whereas when you have no idea of what that is when you're watching the original trilogy in a vacuum, it just makes more sense. You can use your own imagination for what happened in the past and what the Clone Wars were and things like that. But regardless of... I guess the reason why I bring up the vacuum is because... Yeah, it is the best way to watch these movies, is if it was just the year it was released, without the other elements of Star Wars taking over. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. We'll probably go on more later. Do you have any more preliminary thoughts, or do you want me to give some?
Please give some. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, okay. I was just going to start off by saying that Empire it's pretty much always been my favorite Star Wars, though I saw the original, meaning the fourth one first,
yes.
And as a little kid, maybe 3 years old, so obviously it's very easy to fall in love with that movie. You probably covered that in your last video. I haven't seen it, unfortunately. But there's something about Empire that just raises all the stakes, and everything's much cleaner, smoother, and more absorbing. Even in a weird way, it ups the stakes of the previous movie, and it takes you along with all the characters. It separates them, it brings them back together, and it seems like the especially watching it this time now, however many years later, I haven't seen the movie for a while, and having seen more people talk about Star Wars, it's almost, especially the original trilogy, has almost become an armchair sort of scholarship topic over the last 10, 15 years or whatever.
Yeah.
As people, I guess, of the audience of the initial trilogy have aged and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so you hear more about the influence of it, like you mentioned. George Lucas was influenced by Kurosawa and Flash Gordon mostly, and I guess things like World War II documentary footage and things like that, newsreel footage. And I noticed that this one, The Empire, is the one that most accurately does that whole serialized thing. The way it's like paced out and executed, and like it goes off on different tangents, and all the swipe things, and you know what Star Wars, all the editing things it eventually gets known for, which are in the first one, they come into prominence in this movie and work the best. Like in say the prequels, or even to some degree in the third one, you'll have things like the swipe cuts, but things like that don't even need to be there. They just seem like a thing that are there because that's what Star Wars does.
Yeah.
Whereas in this one, it'll cut to like the Millennium Falcon loses after it's gone through the asteroid belt. After that they get caught again, and they set the bounty hunters to catch them, and Han Solo like flies straight at the ship or whatever, and then it cuts away and it cuts back to Luke at, hanging out with Yoda in Dagobah. And the way it does that is like it's a cliffhanger ending,
Yeah.
And what will you see next week with the Millennium Falcon? Will they escape? It's like some sort of old serial thing. And it cuts back to Luke, and so it gives you like time there. Let's say, you watch that scene that goes for 10 minutes. I think the cave scene or something like that comes after that.
Yeah.
So you get absorbed in the cave scene, like a very important part of the movie, and then it cuts back to the Millennium Falcon, who you find out you get the resolution of the cliffhanger of the last episode, in the sequence, and you get that payoff, and the movie's full of that. It'll have like a cliffhanger, cuts away to something else that then gets led to a cliffhanger and a payoff. It takes that great like pulpy page turner / like film serial thing, and it just does it to a T. That like it really keeps you going in the movie, and then not to mention all parts of the movie are great. The opening on Hoth.
Oh yeah,
and then when they get split up, the asteroids, and them getting chased on a Millennium Falcon that's just perpetually being destroyed, and they got to keep fixing it.
Glorious.
Just little things like that to keep the tension going, and to keep the dialogue fresh, and to keep C-3PO, who is probably the prominent expert in that situation. That's another way they work him in. They don't listen to him, even though he's really important to that, and then they don't listen to him because he does like quirky things that don't relate to human interaction, like interrupt Han and Leia kissing and things like that. And Chewie really doesn't seem to know what he's doing with the engineering, and neither does Han. It just seems like they're winging it.
Yeah.
And then that comes into it later, obviously, when they can't get the hyperdrive working because Lando gets sabotaged or whatever.
Yeah, we find out it wasn't even their ship,
Yeah.
I mean, we find out...
Yeah, Lando actually owned the ship,
Yeah, it's like, you won it from me. And it's like, hang on, so it hasn't been Han's ship for all that long, really.
Yeah, I never thought about that. In the movie where the ship's breaking down, it turns out it's actually not even his. Because he's always very protective of it, right from the start of when he's introduced in the first one. Yeah, the movie's just so, like, eloquent in its execution, where, like, things like that you don't think about when you first see it as a kid. It's just great, but... yeah, it does a really good job of everything it like tries to do. So yeah, you can't really fault it for what it does and why so many people appreciate it. It just it makes sense in such a way.
Yeah, I adore The Empire Strikes Back, and in my first video I went through a little outline of why I felt every scene in Star Wars was a great scene. I think this doubly applies for Empire, and to the extent where I almost feel like I don't even need to go into it. Well, we can combine the film into essentially segments based upon the location where it's taking place. I think all of Hoth is gold. I think all of Luke and Dagobah. I think Luke and Dagobah is some of my favorite stuff in film history. I think that stuff is... what a set!
Surprisingly good.
What a set Dagobah is.
Yeah, when you're talking about
is that?
Things before, I was thinking that the movie's
my
so
favorite planet in the original trilogy.
Yeah, maybe that's something to do with its timelessness, like the art
sound
direction.
Effects, like croaking and the noises and the buzzing and the plus of the kind of flute that's playing.
Yeah,
it's great.
It's very organic in a movie that's full of like it juxtaposes inorganic and very organic situations. Darth Vader's ship is very sterile and slick and shiny and such an artificial construction.
Hoth is lifeless by comparison.
Yeah, and then you look at Yoda.
Cloud City.
Yeah, and Luke even when he doesn't understand the Force, he sort of like depreciates the value of Hoth. Sorry, not of Hoth, of Dagobah, and Yoda's just like, oh, you don't understand? I live here, and all these other things live here. And that's things like that play into why it makes sense why Yoda doesn't really want to train Luke, you know? He has such an arrogance that doesn't cohere with the Force.
Yeah.
And then that's his whole drama in the movie, his arrogance in the cave, and then his arrogance for even wanting to help his friends.
Yeah,
Which Yoda, with his like weird stoic wisdom, sees that as like a burden, ironically enough.
Yeah, hey.
Yeah, it's very clever. Like, the movie has... It's no wonder you hear, like, I don't know how serious the theologians and various people in spiritualities and religions across the world want to write about Yoda and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know how seriously you take them, but it's noteworthy that they all want to talk about Yoda, it seems.
Yeah.
He has a very interesting philosophy for a character that only appears in maybe like 20 minutes, 25 minutes of a movie.
Maybe it's the half hour. Yeah, maybe you're right, actually, yeah.
Yeah, he's not in it a lot, probably because of the limitations of the puppet. But even then, I remember reading that critics at the time were amazed that it was a puppet. They thought maybe like it was makeup or something. A puppet can't be that expressive, they would say, you know.
That's Jim Henson and Frank Oz' masterpiece.
Yeah, like the Muppets aren't that expressive.
No,
But Jim Henson, I guess... The Muppets is a different thing.
Yeah.
It is surprising how expressive Yoda is when you watch it. You're just like, wow, it feels like he's an actual thing, you know. Which I remember during the growing up in the early 2000s and the prequels and Lord of the Rings and, you know, CGI is first coming in and people were amazed at how good Yoda looked.
Yeah.
But I find it really fascinating now that, well, like Yoda obviously in the first Phantom Menace looks awful. Infamously. Which is a puppet, and it's a bad puppet. It looks
weird.
Yeah, I can't believe how bad the Yoda puppet looks in the first one, in the Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
But then by the time you get to the second and third in the prequels, Yoda's CG, and I just remember at the time people being amazed. It was like Yoda was like Gollum or something. It's like this great work of CG. But Yoda really in those movies hasn't aged as well as, say, like Gollum or things like that. And that could be because people don't like Yoda's character in those movies, which he's not anything like the Yoda from Empire.
Yeah.
But also, there's just something about it, he's not as expressive in the CGI form, ironically enough. Even though the CG does look pretty good, I think.
Yes.
All the wrinkles and stuff, it is very advanced for the time.
Particularly when you get to the third one, I think.
CGI. Yeah, the third one is a proper step up from the Attack of the Clones.
Yeah.
That was probably some of the best looking CG of its time.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I guess Yoda's he's nailed in Empire, and he's not even quite he's only very briefly like a sort of long cameo appearance in the next movie.
Yeah.
But even then, it's not the same thing.
No.
He just exposes some exposition and you know. Exposits dialogue, I guess I should say, and about Luke having a sister and and things like that. And they have a chat with Obi-Wan briefly.
And Anakin sits down.
But yeah, it's nothing like the well thought out. Lucas, I suppose, obviously he conceptualized the Force, and they say Lee Brackett.
I was going to mention how Lee Brackett is a huge component of this film's success.
Apparently she wrote the first drafts, and then, you know, Kasdan and Lucas, who'd written the first movie. They like, you know, heavily revised it over and over again, got rid of a few concepts which they considered a bit out there.
Okay.
But I'm not too sure. You'd have to go through, like, with a fine-tooth comb and see which parts Lee Brackett is responsible for. But it seems like George Lucas, similar to Tolkien, I guess, who has a very advanced, like, internal, you know, universe and a god that created it in this very neat, like, unique way. He has a unique... he has a unique way of creating the universe. That world has a unique, like, spiritual ecosystem.
Yes.
Which then George Lucas also did, like, in as far as you think about the Flash Gordon and the hero narrative context and the Homeric things. The Force is actually, like, a really neat way to sort of fit that morality of good and evil into that. You know? And it's very well realized. Similar to, you know, the Discord of Melkor is clearly evil, and Iluvatar or whatever, it's clearly it's a rudimentary system of, like, morality, good and bad. A very rudimentary way of viewing the world that comes from, like, you know, it's mythology essentially. It's an earlier way of viewing the world, but Lucas has such a good way of bringing it into, like, the modern context of entertainment and film, you know? It feels very seamless.
Yeah. Yeah,
And people have obviously mentioned, things like the gargantuan walkers, in Hoth, and they're like the Cyclops or whatever. There's those visual illusions,
I've heard
but also
I've heard them compared to the tripods in War of the Worlds.
Tripods, yeah, they are very.
You know who designed those? Actually, there's a futurist designer, and the reason I know who he is because he I'm watching Kershner Gundam right now, and he designed the main mustached white doll Gundam for that program from like 1999-2000. And I think he's one of the Americans who've designed a Gundam for one of these shows.
Okay.
And he helped design, or Lucas was inspired by his designs for the AT-AT walkers. I've read that recently.
Okay.
So that's just a bit of coincidental knowledge I have. This future, he helped design like Blade Runner and some things like that. We can look him up later.
That's cool. But yeah, apparently.
I apologise for not knowing his name now. He died recently, 2019-ish. Sorry.
Yeah, and apparently the Gundam guy Tomino was influenced by George Lucas.
Oh, of
so
course.
that's weird that then George Lucas was influenced back.
Yeah. Well, this guy worked on Gundam much later.
Okay.
In 1999-2000.
So wait, he was influenced by the AT-AT walkers, is what you're saying?
No. This guy had been around for a while, and some of his designs influenced George Lucas for the AT-AT walkers.
Okay, before he'd done Gundam.
Yeah.
Okay.
He worked. Yeah, Gundam. The Gundam show he worked on aired in 1999-2000.
Okay, yeah.
And Gundam premiered in 79. So yeah, they're definitely downstream of Star Wars, of course. I also wanted to say one thing I want to mention about the lead bracket with the screenplay. What George Lucas has claimed about this. So let's take this for what it's worth, I guess. George Lucas claims that in the original script, Lee Brackett had the twist, and it was Obi-Wan killed your father.
Yeah.
And Lucas decided to change this to I am your father. That's his claim. That's what I've read or heard somewhere or other.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, George Lucas would have more authority on like what the characters in a Star Wars script would do, whereas Lee Brackett would come up with these great concepts and things like that. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if Lee Brackett came up with the asteroid field or the big worm or just weird things like that. There's one infamous thing I can't recall, which was like, I guess they considered a bit too risque for Star Wars, which was one of her ideas. You'd have to look that one up later.
I don't know.
Yeah, someone looked that up. Please.
Interesting.
But yeah, I could imagine Lee Brackett was like a sort of sounding board they would bounce ideas off. And, the risque, or like what I think was risque, I think something that was just a bit like antiquated for their time, because Lee Brackett she died before the movie came out. She was quite old by that time.
She's known for writing The Big Sleep from 1946.
Yeah.
Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. She's
With the film.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Because she was like a science fiction writer who I guess a lot of them in that era were working in Hollywood as screenwriters.
Yeah.
I didn't realise how prominent a screenwriter she was, though.
I know her as just being a film person. I know of her as a screenwriter mainly.
Okay.
I guess she.
Yeah, I'd always heard about her as a science fiction writer. I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Like in the magazines and stuff.
Yeah, she had a novel from the mid-50s, which is very famous, which I can't recall what it's called. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean...
Someone name it in the comments if you like.
Yeah, please do. I mean, she's responsible for...
We'll look up later anyway.
This movie, so...
For everyone else's sake.
We should all get around to reading Lee Brackett, I guess, and just check it out.
Yeah, Empire Strikes Back. I used to claim this was like my favourite film of all time until it was supplanted by something like Reservoir Dogs, and I was like, you know how it is, right?
Sure, why?
I still adore that nowadays. Yeah, Empire's better. I still love Reservoir Dogs and like that '90s era of Tarantino, but man, Empire over Reservoir Dogs.
Oh, I'm with you there.
Even though Reservoir Dogs is my favourite Tarantino film.
Reservoir Dogs is good, and it's smarmy, and it likes being smarmy and whatnot. And
I love that DIY aesthetic it pulls off.
Oh, it's a lot of fun as
my
well.
favourite for that reason.
But it's just in a different way to Star Wars.
Yeah.
Star Wars just seems like this. Sometimes you just can't beat ultimate escapism, you know?
Yeah.
Something that pulls it off genuinely well. You know, it's not trying too hard. It just works. It can be better than any film that's trying to go for a more, sort of, generally speaking, a more sort of stylized thing, or like the more... And I think George Lucas was trying to do that with Star Wars. He's going for a universal thing.
Yes.
And where that works in the original trilogy is probably where it doesn't work in the prequels, you know? Where his idea of universal is more... It's less like humanist and more corporate and more like consumerist, you know? That's how I feel about something like the prequels, right?
Yeah, I feel as though I get the impression that George Lucas was under the impression that the original trilogy wasn't going to hold up to modern audiences, and so as a result decided that he was going to make up for that with the prequels, and everything he was insecure about in the original trilogy he was going to compensate for in the prequel trilogy.
Yeah.
And I think, here's the thing, now, I just think George Lucas, whilst it was easy for those films to entertain kids at the time, because kids are entertained by all sorts of nonsense, Shrek, Harry Potter, Home on the Range, whatever you want to, Chicken Little. There's a bunch of garbage from around. I was a demographic. We were a demographic.
Countless.
Yeah.
Like in any era, but having viewed it, it was particularly bad too.
Yeah. And so I think that the man was just out of touch, and The Phantom Menace comes across as a bipolar, like half really good Star Wars film, half 90s Disney, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tarzan, too many comic relief characters nonsense.
Yeah.
And Attack of the Clones was a kind of schizophrenic response to the hatred to the Phantom Menace, and it's worse. As we all know, I'm okay with Revenge of the Sith, just kind of didn't give a fuck, he just did what he wanted. But probably trying to impress film critics there, dare I say, and snobs like me now.
Yeah.
But it's just I feel like I look at the prequels as a big missed opportunity. George Lucas himself would be the first. George Lucas wanted to oversee, like with Empire and Jedi. George Lucas apparently did want to oversee these films with like a Steven Spielberg or someone like that, like with the Indiana Jones trilogy. And those films worked out beautifully. As well, I'm a big fan of Last Crusade or certainly of Crystal Skull, but I think he could have used a. Just like Alvy Ray want to go for the CGI thing, and who enabled George Lucas CGI and who George Lucas funded in the early 80s, Alvy Ray Smith had a John Lasseter for the short films in the 80s. And obviously, by the time of Toy Story, Steve Jobs was kicking Alvy Ray Smith out, unfortunately, of Pixar. We all know that story of the whiteboard. Maybe you don't look it up. It's really funny. Alvy Ray Smith whiteboard incident. But nevertheless, I think Lucas could have used a Spielberg or even a James Cameron maybe. That's a whole other conversation, the James Cameron thing, because Avatar, I haven't seen the new one yet, that's topical, it just came out. But Avatar 2009 reminds me of a lot of issues I had with the Star Wars prequels a little bit. I think this whole thing of... we talked about it yesterday, James Cameron trying to come to this corporate CEO dude, trying to come to terms with his... his privilege in the world, trying to act all spiritual. It's like a corporate CEO on a Buddhist monk retreat. That's what Avatar comes across a little bit to me. Sadly.
Yeah, at least I haven't seen the new one either. But you look at the.
I still want to see the new one eventually.
Yeah, because it does
I
look.
have to.
At least superficially, aesthetically, it looks nice. The underwater stuff does look revolutionary. It's neat. It's similar to, I didn't watch it, but that Top Gun movie, how they I
haven't seen that either.
They all wanted to get in planes and stuff, and you got to, and it's similar to the new Avatar, they all learn how to free dive, and it's you want to say you want to applaud that for getting new different ways of filming things and whatnot with actors, but
that Top Gun thing reminds me of something they do in the silent era with Wings and
so
choreographed. I appreciate it for that. I haven't seen the film. I don't like the original Top Gun, that's more or less why, but you never know.
But there's this underlying problem with all the subtextual messaging and things like that these movies have, where the beautiful shot in the trailer is swimming up to a whale, and then he grabs the whale's hand, and it's just it seems like this forced majestic moment of human relationship to nature that could be harmonious and et cetera, but... and obviously you don't always have to compare the artist to their art, they want to make a message, but especially when it's coming out of some big machine like Hollywood, you don't accuse an outsider artist of not being true to their moral messaging or whatever, because I guess you just don't apply the same standards to someone who's talking about environmentalism and then probably catches jets across America all the time.
Yeah, that's the thing,
it just feels like he's condescending his audience.
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't care about the audience. He's just trying to prove something with the technology and prove something about himself.
Yeah.
That's just how it comes across to me, and so I just don't really want to participate,
Yeah, it's like we learn more about James Cameron than we do our species.
Something like that, And which is neat. I love learning about artists and their unique takes on the world, but, that's not a unique take on the world, which is a common criticism of even the original Avatar, that it's just Fern Gully or Pocahontas or one of those things.
Or Ursula Le Guin, right?
Yeah, and even then, That's the thing. I don't want to be some Nazi who has like an authoritarian about, oh, a movie has to have a set story with beats, with et cetera, et cetera. Like I'd love an experimental movie, especially one pushing visuals and CG and things like that. If then it takes the structure to be experimental and visual, like, if the visuals move the movie forward rather than all these movies like Avatar, which want to be visual spectacles, or the Star Wars prequels, still have countless scenes of traditional exposition dumps and things like that, you know? And MacGuffins like Unobtainium. And they're not experimental movies or visually at all, really. They just become like desktops or moving paintings or something like that, where I don't know, it just doesn't... Like, imagine an Avatar movie with no dialogue. They'd never do that, obviously, but that could be amazing. It would have more potential to be amazing than an Avatar movie that follows a worn, epic narrative structure, you know?
Yeah.
Which, that's why Star Wars was so successful in the first place. In the wake of, I guess, like a 10, 15 years of new Hollywood, which generally, people say is influenced by French New Wave, your Truffauts and your Godards and whatnot. And these very artistic sort of filmmakers make more gritty, documentary, stylized sort of pictures, and then all of a sudden, like, you get something like Star Wars that comes along as a blockbuster, and it brings back that sort of, how you always hear about Shakespeare playing the globe to the commoners, or and it sort of has a movie that doesn't have these like artistic or like cultural pretensions. It plays for a wider audience, but it harkens back to a sort of tradition that unifies everybody. So that's I think that's the great success of Star Wars. Which something like Avatar just doesn't capture, or like a lot of things just don't quite capture. I don't know. Commercially, obviously, the first Star Wars and the original Avatar are very similar. But the Star Wars stuck around in people's minds. Maybe that has something to do with the Avatar 2009 is when it was released.
Yes.
And we're recording this on...
December 18th.
December 18th, Avatar 2, 2022. Avatar 2's just come out. What's that? 13 years later, pretty much.
I was 13 when Avatar came out.
Yeah, exactly. It's been a long time.
Whereas
the movie we've been talking about, The Empire Strikes Back, is 3 years after the original Star Wars, this phenomenon. And it comes along and does it even better and sort of solidifies Star Wars' place. It does the opposite of what Avatar 2 seems to be doing now. Maybe a couple weeks later, Avatar 2 will become the biggest movie ever overnight, and we'll be proven wrong, but I doubt it. It doesn't seem like that's happening.
Avatar in 2009 came across as like this big like carnival theme park ride that you got to go see it. It wasn't like, look what technology can do now, as like imagine Star Wars felt like in 1977, or even what Lord of the Rings would have felt like in 2001.
Lord of the Rings was a whole nother thing. We could talk about that later. But that was definitely more akin to Star Wars 1977 than Avatar was. I agree.
And I think Avatar 1977, it was almost just like, it was not that dissimilar to come over and look at this tech demo, look at this video game with this new great... It's almost like James Cameron felt like he had to compete with video games and like other forms of media that weren't film. Like you'd go into this like installation at like or a VR simulator at an amusement park, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Shrek 4D or something.
If you want, or the SeaWorld 3D ride they used to have there. I don't know if you ever went on that.
No, I don't think I
did.
did.
Fish and such coming at you.
But yeah, these sort of virtual, extra-dimensional experiences, whatever they call them.
Yeah.
Avatar definitely felt a lot like that.
Well, especially 3D was becoming, all that stuff was in 3D, the SeaWorld thing.
Avatar was one of the first of those reeled 3Ds. Remember reeled 3D?
Yeah.
It was like those glasses that were black tinted.
And things coming at you though.
Yeah. It I think the first one was Monster House. If you remember that movie, Monster House had those 3D, because when you think of 3D glasses, it's the traditional red and blue ones, right? The cyan and red. Like the first time I saw a movie with those was like, I guess they were popular in the 60s, right? But then they brought them back a few movies in the early 2000s. Yeah,
gimmicks, like Spy Kids 3D,
Spy Kids
Shark Boy,
3D,
Marvel
which
Girl.
I saw at the cinemas. And there was a thunderstorm outside, and it blacked out the cinema, and so we got our money back for Spy Kids 3D, because of course you would. They're like, oh, you can come back and watch the movie again, we're at the end, or you can get your money back. It's like, I wonder what we'll do. Spy Kids 3D. But anyway, so those had the traditional 3D glasses, but then I think Monster House onward, which then Avatar really propelled it, was that real 3D, which by the time of Avatar, it moved away from the 3D gimmick of, you know, popping things out of the screen to shock the audience, like Shark Boy and Lava Girl, and became like just depth, like
what your 3DS was. Do you remember?
Yeah, like a 3DS. Yeah,
that was a little bit later, but yeah.
And I remember sometimes it would work in the cinemas, but most of the time it just seemed unnecessary.
Kind of gimmicky. Like you go see like Clash of the Titans 2010 or Alice in Wonderland 2010. I didn't see these, but I just assumed like it'd just be depth.
I didn't see Gravity, but I could imagine
that was things coming at you,
because that's depth and things like that. And I guess things do pop at you in that. But like that's
I'm actually an apologist for Gravity. I don't know. I've never reviewed that on this channel.
Yeah, I've only watched Gravity on two-dimensional television.
I saw it at the cinema twice in 3D.
Yeah, I could imagine. There's a good.
And I've seen it on home video a few times since then.
Yeah, like I'm sure going to see it, say on Altered States of Mind back at the cinemas.
That may or may not have happened.
Would have been a fun experience.
It's a rumour.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people have talked about that. It was a common thing for like people to do when Gravity was a thing. And go get stoned and watch Gravity. It became like an event. But
it was an event. It may have been an event.
But yeah, that's just a brief idea of, I guess, the legacy of Star Wars and how all of its technology, you know, that whole thing ended up dominating film.
Yeah.
From then on, like obviously special effects were big in movies before then. Movies were almost founded on special effects.
George Melly's.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, Star Wars, I guess, was a great revival of special effects and. I guess like retellings of epic fantasy tales and things like that for a consumer, like a middle of the road audience.
Yeah.
But it just does it in such a way that's so like affective. I don't know.
Building other worlds on screen, which has become almost the dominant trend of major Hollywood fantasy filmmaking now. Yeah, my goodness. I mean, Star Wars, just this big kind of blanket canvas space opera thing, which many authors have appropriated to their own end, and now Lucas doesn't own it anymore ever since like 2012 or whatever, and like to 2015 The Force Awakens has come out. Now they got rid of all the old EU, now they've got all this new, and they've got Mandalorians and Baby Yodas and Obi-Wans and Boba Fett and the Adventures of Cassian Andor from Rogue One, and we're gonna have, you know, we're going to even have the guys from the Cantina who were in Rogue One briefly going to have a show probably. You know, it's nuts. The oversaturation is ridiculous. Star Trek's even worse. Even Lord of the Rings got a big budget, like prequel spin-off that had nothing to do with anything Tolkien wrote, and everything's horrendous now, I guess. But you know, that's okay, because we can still. I don't know, why is it okay? I'll have to find out. Yeah,
it's a good point. I mean, there's a whole...
Avatar 2 might be okay. Dune, I'm excited for Dune 2. There we go. Dune Part 2, because I'm just a nerd for sandworms, I guess.
Yeah, I'm hopeful for Dune Part 2. I just, yeah, I suppose, though, like, it's... I'm not exactly fresh with this, but people are just waiting for new IPs, you know, something like Star Wars to come along and refresh the whole thing. Maybe the turn we should take is more in line with the new Hollywood movement.
Yeah.
And go back to maybe a bit more well thought out and more worldly attempts at pictures rather than, I don't know, either like appealing to certain subcultural tendencies. Like, you know, whenever you see someone trying to make a good movie these days, it just seems like it's referencing older movies that are considered good or like canonized, similar to like, you know, it feels like the similar criticisms people gave for like rock bands in the 90s onwards who appreciated things like the Stooges. They would say, oh, they're just curating the history of rock music.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of newer films feel like they're doing.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe they're
100%.
somewhere out there's like a fresh take on visual storytelling.
Yeah, especially the curating thing is very true. People were accusing Tarantino of that in the 90s.
Yeah.
Some extremists were probably accusing New Hollywood of that in the 70s.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
I don't know, but I'm sure it's like Pauline Kael have thrown that out there, one of these people. But, Andrew Sarah seemed to champion it. Yeah, like, that's interesting, Matt. Holy crap, yeah.
And it all comes back to Star Wars.
Somehow. It really does. Jonathan Rosenbaum's review of Star Wars in 1977, he expresses concern in almost a Guy Debord-esque sense that this Star Wars is a spectacle, spectacle at a distance is going to dominate the world. And he was right. He couldn't have been more right.
Yeah.
That was the world I grew up in. We look at, as I said this, and I've said this before in other videos and comment, on a video, we look at these great spectacles on the television, and then all the issues of the world, they're also on the television. We donate a few coins to make us all feel better about them, make it go away.
To make this video just even a bit more topical, like at the moment, I don't know how much your audience will care about this. I'm watching the cricket on the screen.
A little bit, yeah.
And from a day ago, they had a crowd of stormtroopers just at the ground. Someone had obviously organised some sort of corporate/social event where these people dress in stormtrooper suits. They get a couple trumpet players to play various themes from the score, and they keep cutting back to stormtroopers. Like at one point, they even had a fight between Rey and Kylo Ren.
I do remember.
And you want to talk about a spectacle? I mean, just having that crossover into like a sport arena is a weird scenario.
Yeah,
it's just become
basically a Comic-Con sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a
kids in the 2009, you get made fun of for being into geek stuff. Now it's very mainstream.
Yeah,
I don't know what did it.
Yeah, like you look at like a show like Spaced, where these people are like eccentric and weirdos for liking a kids' fantasy movie in their adulthood. But it's just commonplace now. And you watch a cricket game and you see 40-year-olds all dressed in stormtrooper outfits playing trumpets to the Cantina theme and stuff. It's just become so ubiquitous in the pop culture.
Is it good or is it bad? It's hard to say.
Well, it doesn't deter my appreciation, at least me personally, and I assume for most people it wouldn't deter their enjoyment from the movies.
Not me personally.
Because it's hard to. They're just good movies. But it just becomes a bit obnoxious. Like you see, it's even a thing that's existed for probably 10 to 15 years now, like I said before, probably, where you'd have like 10 years ago Just Dance Star Wars edition. And you have stormtroopers dancing to an Usher song or something.
Yeah.
And it feels wrong.
Yeah. I remember way back. There's that little documentary you can watch of like the Red Letter Media guys talking about Star Wars in like 2002. And there's like Rich Evans talking about how he loves Star Wars, but then like he'd start going to the gas station, you see cut out of C-3PO and R2-D2 there, and you're just like, really?
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Yeah, they're
like in the special editions, and then the Phantom Menace came out, and they were just everywhere and overexposed. So yeah, I guess it's just doubled down now.
Yeah.
No one's even buying the toys anymore. I remember the Force Awakens had all these toys that no one bought, and they had to put it in a tip somewhere.
Infamous, yeah.
Like the E.T. arcade, Atari games in the 80s.
Because it's such an antiquated idea. I'm sure more adults bought the toys and adults bought it for their children.
Yeah.
Because kids don't play with toys anymore.
I don't think so.
Or even if they do, like toddlers play with soft toys, and kids do still play with toys to some degree. But what's more common is for a parent to give their 6-year-old an iPad or an iPhone or some sort of portable game device, which, like, sure, I had a DS when I was, like, 10, but,
Yeah, I had a Game Boy Advance SP when I was quite young. 7.
Yeah, that stuff's fun, but, yeah, just the whole idea of the toy market doesn't seem like it's as much of a thing. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but especially, like, I always commented on... I mentioned this not long ago. You always hear about the market for Star Wars toys. Initially, kids bought Star Wars toys, they took them out of the packs and they played with them and things like that. Then years later, mint condition toys were worth money because there were very few of them.
Yeah.
If you had an original run of Star Wars toys still in the pack, that was like striking gold because they weren't around.
Yeah.
And then after that became known as a lucrative market. I compare it to I guess comic books is similar. I'm not as knowledgeable on that. But definitely baseball cards where like the 80s baseball cards were like original rare baseball cards were worth a lot, and it became this huge speculative market similar to Star Wars mint condition toys. And people eventually, when they started printing new baseball cards, they were like, oh, they sort of use that prestige of the new market to like say, oh, invest in baseball cards, they'll be worth heaps. And then 20 years later, these baseball cards, and they didn't reveal the amount that they were printing of them. They said they were limited runs and things like that. Meanwhile, they printed millions of them, and they're just ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And so 20 years later, all these people kept these cards in sleeves and stuff, and they go to sell them on the internet, and they're worth 80 cents.
Yeah.
Blinding. And it's very similar, I think, to these new like Star Wars toys.
Yeah.
Where they're made everywhere, and no one wants them, and even if they do get them and keep them in a box, they'll never really be worth that much.
Mm.
But that's a whole nother tangent of collecting for like speculative
Beanie Babies.
Yeah, things like that. And I guess George Lucas he might have started that whole thing. Because obviously after the Star Wars toys take off, you get things like Transformers toys, but obviously things predate Star Wars toys like G.I. Joe or whatever.
I don't think G.I. Joe predate. G.I. Joe I think is an 80s thing.
It's from the 60s.
Okay.
Because there was
the cartoons in the 80s, excuse me.
Okay, yeah. I think the toys started in the 60s.
The Planet of the Apes toys were huge, and they were done by Kenner, who did the Star Wars toys.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Kind of continuity there.
The Planet of the Apes toys infamously.
And they're also worth a lot of money if you get them in the box.
I could imagine, yeah.
Apes toys.
Yeah. Get like a little Dr. Seuss.
Totally. Yeah, I'll never forget, I once overheard, I guess, discussion about toys, like Star Wars and Star Wars toys, or toys in general, and like my mum's brother's turning to his older brother and kind of shaking his head and going, if only we knew, because they obviously had a lot of Star Wars toys, and they're all gone now.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because, exactly, that's case in point as to why they ended up being worth so much. If only everybody knew, right? But then that's the thing, if everybody does know, they're not worth anything. It's just happy accidents, right?
Watching Star Wars in 1977, Jonathan Rosenbaum, if only you knew how right you were in a way. I still appreciate Star Wars, but just as a film. But yeah, like it is a cultural phenomenon, as the spectacle, as Guy Debord might describe it, or pour it as.
Yeah.
I don't know, like it's hard to argue against that. And it takes a little bit of effort to not get too lost in it as well, I have to admit.
Especially when the spectacle, since we did briefly talk about the new trilogy, has just become this like worn format of television miniseries drama.
Oh yeah.
Where I've noticed recently, very recently, people have talked about, every show gets talked about like just by critics in newspapers and stuff, nothing critics. They love using the word slow burn for shows, as if like a show just moving along doing nothing is like a good trait in itself.
Yeah.
It's this weird reactionary thing to like, movies like Marvel and things like that, they move too fast and nothing makes sense, and so I want to watch a show where nothing happens at all. Just like, what? Television used to be that. Television used to move really quick and not make as much sense as movies, which are all more well paced out. And I don't know, it just seems like the whole, let's make a show move slowly because it'll develop a character. It's just such a trite way of like writing that's what Star Wars seems to have fallen into recently.
Yeah.
Doing those quote unquote slow burn shows. Which are sort of like antithetical to Star Wars in the first place. Like maybe it's unfair. Maybe if I was 8 years old, I would like a show about like Boba Fett's race being like Wild West cowboys. Maybe that would be cool, but not if it has these like pretensions of being arty and moving slow and building character and stuff. Seems like that would be better as an animated show or something.
Yeah.
Cowboy Mandalorian people in animation doing action
like 2003
stuff.
Clone Wars.
And they can still have character, but yeah, exactly. Seems like Star Wars now, ever since it's been bought by Disney, at least George Lucas did have an original artistic vision. Whether it always worked or not is one thing.
Oh yeah, Jedi. Just to be clear, Jedi has many. Yeah, the Jedi has many problems.
We haven't talked about that much, and that's probably indicative of that.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
And anything good about Jedi has already been said to death. Really.
Yeah.
We probably could extrapolate something from it, but yeah, I was just gonna say that George Lucas at least had an original vision or something. Good or not, whereas Disney just go at it with this boardroom mentality of like, let's just insert Star Wars into whatever tropes of the day.
Yeah, precisely.
It reminds me of like a video game series like Halo, which just became that at one point, It's just like, let's insert ourselves into the tropes of first-person shooter games, and not have anything fresh to bring, all new Star Wars IPs and products just feel a bit like that to me.
Yeah.
First in the new trilogy with their own work, and then now just emulating, I don't know, Westworld and other popular shows over the last 5-10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also, there's something about the whole, like, we're talking about all these, like, different, like, little variations on... These shows only work because an audience member wants to see the continuing adventures of, like, an established thing, whether it's Obi-Wan or Boba Fett or a character from Rogue One of all, you know, Cassian Andor, you know, and it's just, like...
Where'd that come from?
Yeah, like, it's just, like... It's all just based on iconography. It's like I've complained about the James Bond films only existing on iconography. And, you know, it's like, you think that thing's cool because they have the music playing and it's like, oh, look, James Bond is doing this thing. And it's just like, okay, like, you know, I just don't... Can't it just speak for itself? Like, you need you to tell me that it's cool, you know what I mean? Like, be cool. It's a contrivance, but, you know. I don't know. I think... Yeah, I feel like I'm done for now on Star Wars. I'll eventually commit to a video on Return of the Jedi. I'm not sure what unique novelty I'll take with my Jedi video. Who knows? I'll think of something, I hope, anyway. But, yeah, this was a fantastic, nearly an hour discussion.
Really?
Yes. On The Empire Strikes Back, and I guess Star Wars in general, and film, entertainment, media, the spectacle in general. What a fantastic time. Do you have anything else to add, Dio?
No, not off the top of my head. Cool to close it there.
I'm happy to as well. Awesome. Thanks everyone for bearing with this. Have a great day, night, wherever you are. I hope everyone is as well as you will ever be.